sponsored by the Friends of the Rogers Public Library. You want to hear Sirena Evans of the Prairie Ridge National Military Park. Am I getting that right?
Pea Ridge National
Pea
Military.
Ridge. And who is going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the history of cosmetics and home remedies.
Thank you for having me today. Okay, so just to give you sort of an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, it's going to be mainly the Victorian period from 1840s to 1870s. Not necessarily going into too much before that, other than some recipes and things like that, and I'm not really going beyond that. Also, we're going to talk about some products, some home remedies, people, that what did they use, what did they not use during that time period, sort of how they thought about those kinds of things. What people from the early Victorian era thought what hygiene was, or what they didn't think hygiene was. It's a little bit different than what today is. And how those benefits, how it benefited in culture, fashion, and any type of beauty trends from that time period also kind of morphed those ideas as well. So first we have to try to take our 21st century mind out of the picture of this and try to think like a Victorian. So in that time period, cleanliness was becoming more of a must in Victorian society. So you were having not just two main classes, either you're rich or you're poor, you had this new middle class that was arising. So there was, people were basically being able to merge a little bit in between each of them. They actually associated with each other a little bit more. The poor hygiene was also associated with disease at this point. They didn't have the complete concept of what that meant or the real idea of germs yet, but it was starting to be linked. A good Victorian was always known to be clean in body and mind. Always, cleanliness is next to godliness in a lot of respects. That sort of came from Victorians. Also, some people were taught to be cleaner than other people, depending upon how you look at it when you think about hygiene in some ways. And then a lot of the ways that people learned things back then was either by their family, community, newspapers, pamphlets, women's magazines, things like that. They didn't have a lot of course, they didn't have TV or commercials, so they weren't necessarily impacted by knowledge that we may be able to gain today by infomercials and the concept of cleaning products and that kind of stuff. Advertisements did affect them, but it wasn't quite as pronounced as it is today. And if you had the money to be clean, of course, or you had the ability to have people work for you to be cleaner, you would be cleaner. So Victorian cleanliness, of course, the more money you had, the more time you could spend on being clean or having your home clean or be able to afford people to clean for you. That time period didn't have a lot of the nice modern conveniences that we have today, like vacuum cleaners that, I don't know how to live without mine. But of course, your first, middle, and lower classes all had kind of a different concept. If you were raised with not having a lot of money, your kind of concept of being clean and having good hygiene just might not meet that expectation of a higher class that was able to afford a lot more things like fancy soaps and cleaners and that kind of stuff. There was things you could buy from different general stores. There was more products coming out, more things that would be advertised in the newspapers that you could buy if you had more money. Also, kind of the concept of being poor, you were trying to survive rather than thinking about just being clean, so that was also part of it. And then the quality of your environment really dictated a lot how hygienic you were going to be. So if you lived in the city, in the muck, and a lot of everything that happens because of a lot of close people living together, your cleanliness may not be as good as if you live in the country where your health might also be better because you were able to stay away from all kinds of things that could cause problems with you not being clean. So in this time period, we have to think like a Victorian. The germ theory had come out. There was the concept that germs could cause smells, germs could cause problems with health, but not everybody had widely accepted that. Not everybody was still kind of in the know in that concept. They had, a lot of people just didn't understand the whole germ theory until much later, so you have to keep that sort of in mind for this period. Now, there was the idea of this miasma theory, and what that is basically the concept of bad air or bad smelling air could get you sick or could cause problems in hygiene and that kind of a thing. If you've ever heard of, if you breathe or smell something or otherwise it was bad air, that bad air could also be contributed to bad hygiene in some respects. So everybody in this time period smelled bad. There wasn't really any way of getting around that. They didn't have deodorant as we do today. There were things that they could do to try to combat that, which we'll get to in a little bit, but that concept was not quite there. So if someone were to think that the air around you was bad, that was kind of the miasma theory. So if you were to get sick or something, if you ever had somebody say, well, you've got a cold, that concept comes from bad or actually cold air is where that saying comes from. So it also, depending upon how much education you would have, depends on where that would have a lot of standing with you. Sometimes it had a lot more to do with superstitions rather than what actually was bad or good air. Now there was some validity in this, in that bad smelling things can cause a lot more germs, so if you stay away from that, you'll probably be healthier, you'll probably be cleaner, but it didn't always work that way. Of course, bad air was supposed to be able to cause cholera and the Black Death and all kinds of different types of different diseases and things, but if we had, some of it actually had some sense in that if you're around a person who had those things and the air smelled bad, you might be able to get it, but it didn't quite work like that. They didn't understand it very well yet. So when it came to like actually cleaning your home or cleaning an area, the concept was more removing dirt, removing the look of things being dirty, having things put in order, having things put in its place was sort of more the idea of what was clean or not. And then so you would remove dirt, you would sweep, you would dust, you would remove rotten food or things that didn't smell good. Of course, we're going to be super focused on your sense of smell and your sight, not necessarily what you know is necessarily bacteria or something like that. We'll come around to later. So you also wanted to make sure that the air smelled fresh around you and like just fresh air, like having a window open. So a lot of people at night would sleep with their windows open because of this miasma theory, because they didn't want bad air to kill them at night. And that was just sort of a superstition that they had. When it came to gas lighting and things a little bit into the 1870s, they kind of had, a little bit of validity to it, but not always. So some of the cleaning agents that they did use that they may have not known that actually helped with this cleanliness, that actually did kill germs or help with those things, they would have anything from lye soap. And so lye soap was made from, you take a bunch of ash and you pour water over it, and as it comes down through the ash, it comes out as lye, and that's sort of what that part is. So lye soap is usually made out of that lye from ash that you can pull out, and then beeswax, and then also animal fat. So you cook all that together and you have your lye soap. If you leave that, if it's super heavy in the lye, it can be detrimental to your skin. It can cause skin problems if you keep it on your skin for a long time, any type of lye. You're cleaning like your floors with lye soaps, you have to make sure you rinse everything really well. Of course, they also have water, of course. How well the water or how good it was from either, if you lived in the city, your water quality is going to be much worse than it is necessarily if you lived in the country. Of course, the best water at that time period that you could get would be probably from either a well or from a spring, and that would be your highest quality of water you could have, in that it would be the safest to drink or use. Of course, vinegar, they didn't know back then that vinegar basically killed germs, so when they did use it to clean, it also took away a lot of stains and stuff like that. They were also removing germs, so that helped their cleanliness and the smell factor of killing the bacteria. Of course, they used baking soda, had been widely used for years. A lot of home remedies, a lot of home cleaning kind of tactics were used with baking soda, just because also you have the concept of the baking soda is white, so if I clean with it, it's gonna make everything else white and clean. Sort of a superstition, kind of the concept that they had. Again, we're using our nose and our eyes as a sense. And then of course they used anything from acids to alcohol. Borax was very popular in that time period. To get a lot of stains out, they would use milk, which was one of the things that they would use as home remedy. There are certain types of stains you can get out, like ink stains. You can use milk and it will take it out, and that kind of a thing. And then of course, lime and ammonia and wax was used in almost anything to try to get. You could use wax to pull some stains out of clothing, depending upon how you did it. So Victorian mindset, if it looks clean and it smells clean, then it is clean. That's sort of your idea at that time. Not necessarily the way it works, but that's the way they thought. Their concept in sort of the hygiene aspect of it was a little bit different than what we consider a hygiene today. So they did have the concept of brushing your teeth, cleaning your teeth would help. Everybody in the same house might use the same toothbrush, not necessarily how we would do it today. And they'd also use maybe that toothbrush for several years until it was just totally falling apart, all the bristles fell out. Sometimes children would use a smaller one just because the toothbrushes back then had huge heads on them. I call them like horse toothbrushes because they take over the whole mouth. Worked sort of. Your toothpaste, they didn't have it yet. So what they had was usually like a baking powder consistency with some mint in it, either like ground mint. They also used soot to clean your teeth. Actually, it was very effective at whitening it as well. They didn't really know that, but it did work. And a lot of those things that they used was what was readily at hand. Didn't necessarily cost a lot, but you could buy tooth powder. You could go to almost any general store and buy that kind of thing. And then, of course, you had, if your hands and your face looked clean, they were clean, one way or another. And then they didn't necessarily bathe every day. Most of Victorians in that time period, what they would do is their outside clothing was not cleaned a lot. They would clean all of their underclothing, what would smell the worst, closest to them. And then the outside clothes would very rarely get cleaned. Clothing back then was very expensive to produce, and it was actually worth a lot more than what we would consider it today. Like everything you had would be name brand because it was handmade. Think of it sort of like that concept. So you would take much, much better care of things. And clothing was used until it literally was disintegrated. So they would take dresses and they would take them apart when they started to wear out and use them to rags all the way down to whatever they had to. And a lot of, like I said before, everything was going by your like what you could smell and what you could see. So when it comes to hygiene and bathing, hot water was very hard to come by. You had to do a lot of work to get hot water. Either you boiled it on the stove. There were stoves that were starting to come out that you would have a boiler on the back of it that you would fill with water. When you heated up the stove as a whole piece, that water would boil as well and get warm, but you would have to have that to your ability to have it. So bathing really for younger kids probably happened more. They also might get dirtier than adults would. So they would be cleaned more often than, say, an adult. They also, because they didn't take as much hot water to clean them, it was easier to do it over and over again. And then undergarments, again, were changed and cleaned every day. Outside clothing, for women's dresses, a lot of the time you would clean the hem of the dress because it would get a little bit dirty from being around dirt, or the bottom of pant legs and things like that. Also, you would have detachable collars for both men and women, and then you wore gloves, or you would go through a lot of gloves. average person might have 10 pairs apiece, depending upon their economic level. And because they wore gloves outside of the home, that also helped keep germs out of the home, because you came home, you took those gloves off, you didn't have those germs in your home anymore. So they did some things back then that were sort of more of a fashionable sense that actually helped in their hygiene, but they didn't quite know it yet. Of course, any outer layers they would also try to change and clean, because they would become more dirty. So you would wear, for women, a pinner or an apron, and that was basically, it kept your outer clothes clean. For children, even boys wore kind of dresses up to a certain age. They would go out and play. You'd have an outer layer of a pinafore that would keep them cleaner, and then you wouldn't have, it was also to protect the clothing. So you protected your clothing from the dirt by wearing something on the top, then you protected the clothing from yourself by wearing something underneath it. So that's how sort of the underclothes worked as well. So cleaning clothes at that period of time was back-breaking, time-consuming work. You could, if you lived in the city, you could send your clothes out to a large cleaners that might have 12 to 20 women doing all of the processes of cleaning. They didn't have necessarily industrial cleaning centers yet, but everything was still, in some respects, done by hand, sometimes on larger levels than smaller ones. But again, it took a lot of water. It took a lot of heated water, because it was impossible to get stains out without having a little bit of hot water. So if you lived in the city, you could send it out, get it cleaned, bring it back. Of course, that's going to cost money. If you were in the poorer sort of realm, you would try to do the best you could. You probably didn't clean your clothes very often, or even change them. And that was just a reality of how they lived. It was basically because of what they just didn't have, either the funding to keep themselves clean or their clothing, or they just had the means in a lot of respects. So to do a lot of cleaning, when you use the lye, as I said before, if you keep it on your skin for a long period of time, it can start to eat away. If you clean it like a shirt, a men's shirt, you get it through the process of washing it, rinsing it, kind of wringing it out with a wringer, all done by hand. And then you would iron it with an iron and beeswax. If some of that lye was still on there, once you wore it, you would probably wear that shirt probably 3 or 4 days when it started to smell super, super bad, or could stand on its own. That's when it would probably be cleaned at that point. But sometimes if you don't get all of that lye out, it can also start growing things on it. So that was part of their cleanliness issues with that. So to clean stuff and to make it whiter or cleaner, of course they used lye soap. They would use borax, which was basically, it's a combination of baking soda and a few other elements that gets rid of stains, also helps smells and stuff. And then they would use a bluing agent that actually would make things whiter. So you would use a blue, so sometimes it came made out of powder, sometimes it was liquid, and it would help to make things whiter. The same concept today is if you get your hair dyed, it has sort of that blue tint, same sort of process. And then of course ironing. You could also use gin to clean clothes. So if you sprayed alcohol on outer, nicer clothing, it would, when it dried, basically it would absorb that smell of body odor, and then when it evaporated, that smell would go away. Now, it wasn't perfect, but it did help some. So this is an image of a governess from 1861, and one of the first kind of concepts of a adult bath was put out by a German doctor. It was more for like health purposes rather than cleanliness. And it was a sit bath was what it was. His last name was Sids. This ended up being Americanized to sit. So it's what this is over here. And your legs would hang out of it and you would pour water over the top of you. And it was really more for health problems with anything from arthritis to migraines and things like that, they were starting to understand that if you warmed up the body a little bit with water and then cleaned it, maybe that would help with other things, but it was, your feet would hang out of it. So this would be your first sort of bath, but again, you have to heat up all that water to use it. So also in this sort of picture, you have your water basin. So if you, in your home, you would probably, if you, depending upon your economic level, how large your house was, almost every room, bedroom, sometimes in living rooms or parlors, you would have a sort of a little area that would have a base of water that you could wash your hands in. And I mean, you're not gonna continuously be able to go get water because this obviously is more of an attic room for governess. So either you had servants that would be able to bring the water up, they didn't have plumbing quite yet. So you had to use as little water as you could to clean, so that was another reason why their hygiene was not as good as it could be. So in the cleanliness of cleaning your hands and face, they started to have in also kind of developing with makeup. So at this time period, for women, natural was the best. They didn't have a lot of putting a lot of makeup on the face because it was associated with things of ill repute. You would never want to be considered a woman of the night. A lot of risk came with wearing a lot of makeup. They did wear theater makeup, of course, for theater productions, and that was totally acceptable. But when it came to being out in society, because of fashion, because of morals, Victorians had very high morals. It's one of the reasons makeup wasn't used as much. But they did have different things that they could use to use as cosmetics, but they had to do it very covertly in many respects. Some of the things they would do for makeup in that time period was you wanted to clean the face, so that's part of the hygiene. You could do that with some different things. Anything from, for the time period, part of being beautiful was to be as, you were not tan. Tan was not being a thing. If you were tan, it showed that you worked out in the sun, and that was bad for some reason. And then, of course, you wanted to have as little different flaws on your face, from moles to freckles or anything like that. So you could get rid of those things, supposedly, with trying to bleach your face out with different products. There were things you could buy in the store to do this, but things like lemon water and lemons would help. And that was found in a lot of beauty magazines and things like that, was where women got some of those ideas. So you didn't want to have any freckles, any moles. You wanted natural lashes, natural pink lips, no eyeliner. Supposedly they did use some eyeliner. Not too much facial hair whatsoever for women. Men, it was a little bit different. But when it came down to it, part of your beauty in that time period came from this look of being almost like a dying angel. And that had been popularized from the concept of when women would get tuberculosis or consumption, the main things that they would look like is they would have super white skin. They would look almost like angel-like, is what one of the biggest description was of it. So when you got to this point, that was sort of your epitome of what beauty would be. And that's what women who were not sick or tried to look sick would start doing for their beauty regimen. And that was the most popular at the time. So you wanted to have pale skin, rosy cheeks, and glassy eyes. And there was a few things that they could do to make this happen. Now, as we see Edgar Allan Poe has to say here, a lot of this was, of course, not healthy, but also they had to they had to do it with a lot of secrecy. Because if you did a lot of beauty stuff to your face, it was considered to be immoral, and also that you were part of society that nobody wanted to be with. So here are some examples of what it would have looked like or what they thought your ultimate beauty was. Here is a woman who is sick with something, probably consumption, TB, who knows. She has a very light skin, and when it came to people of different races, the lighter your skin was, the better, or if you looked pale, kind of slightly with a little bit of moistness to your skin, like it was hydrated, your eyes were kind of glassy. Not necessarily the best beauty look, but that's what they were going for. This also is another photo of a woman. She has a red ribbon around her neck, but it also kind of is telling in this particular painting because it almost looks like she's trying to slit her neck, slit her throat, because it looks like blood's kind of going down her back to make her have that drained sort of sickness look. So that was what you were trying to achieve. Here's another couple of different pictures. Even though this woman here, because she's in all black, she's obviously in mourning, because she has this look of the ultimate beauty, she's being picked on by this gentleman, we'll call him. And then over here is another sort of concept of that angel-like mother figure of what your beauty would sort of be the ultimate look. So when it came to cleaning your face or trying to get rid of different types of acne or whatever you might have, there were certain things you could do that they didn't realize was super helpful, but they did. Queen Victoria was known for cleaning her face with chamomile tea, which it had a lot of killing of bacteria qualities they didn't realize then, but was very helpful. Also, you could do rose water or lavender water. Not only did these things smell good, but they had a lot of antibacterial features. I mean, it wasn't completely going to kill it just like alcohol would, but it did help with a lot of facial acne and things like that. Of course, there was other things that you could buy in stores that had been recipes that had come on, had been around since the Egyptians, and some of those things were called orange blossom milk, which is not milk. It was just a cleanser that was moisturizing. It helped to clean acne, helped to clean oily and redness. Again, they would use lemon water to clean dark spots off. It was kind of, the concept was to bleach your skin away a little bit. It would supposedly get rid of freckles. Sometimes it might work, sometimes it might not. And then of course, they would use sometimes vinegar as well as sort of a cleaning agent to try to bleach different things away out of your face. Also, they had red rose vinegar, which was for puffiness under your eyes. You'd only use a little bit of it, not a whole lot. Virgin's milk was very popular. It had been for sale for a long time. You could buy it in almost any general store that you'd find. You basically put some drops of it in your water to wash your face, and it would help do some cleansing. It was made out of a few oils and things like that. Was it super helpful in reality? Sort of, but not really. So in cosmetics, when you were thinking about wanting to achieve this ultimate sickly-like look, you wanted to try to color your lips to be just a little bit pink. So you could use beet juice. Something else that they would use is a red tissue paper, and you just wet it a little bit and pinch your lips on it, and it will give your lips a little bit of a tint. You can also use the beet juice to put on your cheeks to give a little bit of a rosy kind of a look. They would use coal from your fireplace. You just put a little bit on either a stick or a brush, and you could use that to outline your eyes very, 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 very little, not very much at all. And then you could use drops for your eyes that had belladonna in it, and that basically made your pupils bigger, or smaller rather. Kind of gives you a glossy look to achieve that sickness. Also, you could use some powders. Now, some of the cosmetics that they had for sale had either mercury or lead or arsenic in them. The reason they used those particular elements was because they helped to basically pull everything together. It was kind of like it would make either a paste especially mercury. If you ever had played, if you've ever played or seen mercury, it just sort of like moves around on your hand. It doesn't actually like stick to your skin, but if you combine it with other elements, it'll make sort of a paste or almost like a greasy kind of a substance. So that's why it was really useful in this cosmetic look and use of cosmetics. Of course, they didn't have talcum powder yet. That hadn't quite been invented. So they did use rice powder, or ground up shell powder was very popular to kind of give your face a little bit of a whitening look. Now you always did all these things very, very lightly. It was never like caked on. And also it was easier to wear makeup at night because your lighting was not very good. You didn't have super good lighting yet. Electricity had not been quite invented. You did have some gas lighting, but it was going to be easier with the shadows of the light to achieve this sick look as well. So the ultimate beauty regimen or the ultimate beauty look was called pearl white. And what you would do to achieve this, there was a couple of actresses, stage actresses, who made this look very popular. And so you would clean the face, you would shave all the hair off, except for your eyebrows. You would apply a lead-based or mercury-based white cream powder. These cream powders were more popular in the 17th century, especially in French courts. They were still around at this time period, but used it all over your face, neck, up to where your dress line would come up to on your chest. If you remembered, you put it a little bit over your ears, and sometimes they would wear it for very long periods of time and absorbing your mercury and your arsenic, which was super good for your body, but that's what you do for beauty. Of course, they would also use a little bit of beet juice, probably for the cheekbones. You could also use it for your lips. If you wanted to make your eyes sunken a little bit, you could put a little bit on the top of your eyelid, and that would help give sort of that angelic look as well. Then, of course, you would use that rice powder on your face very lightly, not a lot, just always very light. And then the crepe paper was also something that was very popular to use because you could hide it, or when you went out to a store to buy red crepe paper or tissue paper, it's not something that somebody would be like, oh, you're going to be using this for makeup. That's not what they first thought. So it was something you could buy and use without getting caught really easily. And then, of course, they would use some castor oil to make the eyelashes look a little bit more defined. This is still used today. It will help the health of your eyelashes. Didn't really hurt you whatsoever. You just kind of use a whole lot of it. And then they would also, of course, use a little bit of kohl to line the eyes, only on the corners though. And then you have to use those belladonna drops because they'll make your eyes look super glossy and pretty. So that would be your ultimate look. Now, some of the other things that they had in this time period for hygiene / taking care of yourself, if you want to look at it from a beauty perspective, is they would have, this is a French manicure set, and it's made out of ivory. It is very close to the time period, not perfectly, but they had a lot of different things in this. They didn't have the safety clippers that we have today, so they'd use just some small scissors to cut your nails. And then they didn't have emery boards like we have today. They would use emery powder. They would take a little bit of emery powder and just kind of use a little bit of a cloth, and that would cut down on any of your little burrs or anything you had on your nails. And then you would take one of these and it would help polish your nail out. Usually this would have a little piece of either some type of linen cloth on it or some leather that was really fine as well. Now, as I said before, Queen Victoria would clean her face with chamomile tea, and that's what I have over here in this pot. We also have a little bit of coal from your fire that you could use to outline your eyes. You could buy hair dye in this time period. You could make it as well from home. In some of the women's magazines that were out, they did tell you how to do it. And from some of the reading that I'd done, they were very specific on how much you should dye for what color of hair you have. So it was always very detailed instructions on just use just a tiny bit of dye for this much of, like if you had red hair, if you had black hair. Obviously, in instances like Anna Green Gables, she didn't get all that news or didn't have all that information, so her hair turned green. But they did sell hair dye in tiny little bottles like this. Of course, they did have some hair oils and things. Hair fashion at this time kind of was a little bit different, depending upon from 1840s up to the 1870s. Most of the time you wanted your face to look super wide, and you wanted your hair to be slicked down and back and pulled up. Basically your ultimate look. They had a lot of palm olives. Men and women would use these, and it was like a greasy or oily kind of texture of a substance. It also smelled a little bit like rosemary or roses, and that kind of helped with the smell as well. Men and women's hairbrushes were about the same. Toothbrushes generally about the same as well. Of course, you might not have your own toothbrush. And then I didn't cover a lot of some of the men's things that they had, but of course, they mainly just looked clean. Men were always beautiful, of course. And they would shave and comb back their hair. Men's clothing and fashion and hygiene sort of did not change at all from 1800 to 1900. It's about the same. They would use some of the same things that women would use if they had problems, like if they needed to clean their skin and stuff like that. But unless they were on the stage, they didn't really wear makeup. So that was never an issue for them. So I have some of the different things that they could have used up here, but does anybody have any questions?
You talked about bleaching beauty spots and also, of course, dealing with laundry, but at this time, were they able to synthesize chlorine and use that kind of a bleach, or did they just use acids?
They mainly just used acids or baking soda or borax. Chlorine was not, or like what we would consider bleach today, was not quite developed. And they were trying to develop, they would get to it a little bit later, but it would be more in a crystallized form rather in a liquid form. And it was very volatile, so it was not safe to have really in your normal home.
Did they drink water during this time period?
They did. It could make them be very sick. So of course, when it came to living in the city, it was actually safer to drink beer or ale than it would be to drink straight water. And people who drank straight water noticed they were getting sick from it, so that's why they kind of stayed away from it. When you lived in the countryside, your water was generally a little bit more pure, so you could drink more water and it would be safer. But it really depended on where it came from.
Did Lewis pasture, did he create the pasteurizing process? He was like on your first slide.
Mm-hmm. He had some development in it. So there was up to a certain point, I don't remember the exact year, but they started to, most people just drank milk straight from a cow. There wasn't any pasteurization. But once they started boiling the milk a little bit after they had gotten it out of the cow, they noticed that it would last a little bit longer. Also, it broke down some of the bacteria that would cause it to go bad quicker, and that's part of that concept, but I don't have all the information on that.
I mean, they realized people were dying from use of mercury and arsenic.
They didn't necessarily know that that was what was causing it, and generally it wasn't something that happened super quickly, so it would take a long time to be exposed to mercury for a long time to start having a lot of problems from it. Some of your first things would be headache. Of course, they used that you'd have diarrhea from mercury. They did use mercury during the Civil War. If you were constipated, you would get mercury, and it would help clean you out, but then you'd also need to stop that. So it was sort of a constant problem that they could never quite find something that would either, they were always having a problem of either getting a solution to it, but then you'd have it on the other perspective of things. So you either be stopped up or you would have lots of diarrhea. And unless you had a really good diet of fruits and vegetables, they didn't quite have that concept yet. They were just starting to get into the knowledge of what good foods would help your body going into the 1880s, 1890s. Okay, if anybody wants to come up and look at some of the products that I have, I'd be more than welcome to talk to you about them. But thank you for listening for me today.